The report I'm doing is blocking Montana's future. As you've heard, the coal strip generating plant is scheduled to close by 2027. It may happen even sooner. NorthWestern Energy is interested in replacing this power, but their interests in doing so are very, very different than the interests of Montanans. NorthWestern Energy is a monopoly. As a regulated public utility, they are supposed to be regulated by the PSC, but they have monopoly power. In the eyes of NorthWestern Energy, you, the customers, you, the people of Montana, are not their stakeholders. It's their stockholders that they care about. Regulation is supposed to protect the public and the ratepayers, but at least since corporations were deemed people, this hasn't really been working out so well for Montana. Montanans have tasted energy independence in the form of particularly home solar, and they like it. According to a 2016 poll, 90% of Montanans supported increased use of solar. Since 2011, this support has ranged between 85 and 90%. Okay, where'd that go? Let's see. I told you I'm a neophyte on PowerPoints. There we go. In 2015, net metering solar added 2,100 megawatts to the grid nationally, enough to power 420,000 homes. This is the fourth year in a row that net metering solar grew by above 50% a year. Solar added 73,615 jobs nationally in 2016. There were 374,000 jobs in solar in 2016 compared to 187,000 jobs in oil, gas, and coal combined. It's where the jobs are. So what's the problem? It seems that Montana law does more to protect the out-of-state profits of NorthWestern Energy's owners than it does to protect Montanans, at least the way that law is enforced in Montana today. Montana law limits net metering payments to systems that are rated for 50 kilowatts or less. North Dakota and Wyoming double this to 100 kilowatts. Idaho and Oregon have a cap of 25 kilowatts for residential, and that's fine for residential, but they too have much higher caps for commercial. Idaho's commercial cap, 100 kilowatts. Oregon's commercial cap, 2 megawatts. Again, Montana's overall cap, including commercial, just 50. NorthWestern Energy's lobbyist at one point appearing before the legislature a few years back termed net metering a cancer on the system. Well, it's a cancer on the system if you're trying to maintain monopoly control. It's sure not a cancer if you're a citizen of the state of Montana trying to save a little money and have a little more control over your energy. Is NorthWestern Energy struggling because of the impact of growing solar? Not exactly. Between 2011 and 2016, their net income has soared 77%, from 92 million to 164 million. So they're not hurting. NorthWestern Energy uses the money it makes to grease the way with the legislature and the PSC. Before and during the 2015 legislature, they had 4 lobbyists plus $6,500 to wine and dine legislators at the Montana Club. They donated 11,000 to 72 Republicans on top of the lobbyists' expenditures and $120 to one token Democrat. They spread the money around a little bit more in 2017. They doubled the number of lobbyists, or increased by 50%, to 6. They increased their campaign contributions a little bit, spread it around, 9,300 to 62 Republicans and 2,500 to 19 Democrats. 8 out of 13 members of the Senate Energy Committee received donations from NorthWestern Energy or NorthWestern Energy PAC. So what did their money buy them? What happened? How did the legislature behave? In 2015, a Democrat and a Republican jointly came together and sponsored a bill to raise that net metering cap that I talked about before for commercial and public buildings to 1,000 kilowatts. The bill never came out of committee. They got even more results in 2017, despite the fact that there was a substantially ramped up effort in the legislature by renewable groups favoring renewables. NorthWestern Energy beat back all efforts and passed several bad bills that fortunately were vetoed. Start with HB 24. These are bills that are good for renewables. This bill would have raised the net metering cap just for state buildings, just for the government, to 250 kilowatts. 11 people testified in support. There was only one opponent, and that opponent was a lobbyist for the only opponents, two lobbyists for NorthWestern Energy and a lobbyist for Montana Dakota Utilities. 2 weeks after the hearing, the bill passed 9-7 in the committee, despite a no vote from its sponsor. But when it passed, the committee chair called for a recess, and after 90 minutes in the hallway, they came back and took another vote. This time 8-8, which meant the bill died in committee. HB 504, and this was a pretty comprehensive bill. Solar Jobs and Energy Freedom Act, it was called, and it received a lot of NGO support. This bill raised net metering cap to 1,000 kilowatts. It required power companies to aggregate net metering. It provided for neighborhood net metering. What that is essentially is if you have a neighborhood with a lot of trees, the neighborhood can get together, put one set of panels in one location that's not shaded, and everybody in the neighborhood share it. It provided excess energy generation that came out of the system that went over the cap, instead of ending up in NorthWestern Energy's pocket because they didn't have to give any kind of energy credit. That excess power would go to assist the poor. As I said, there was strong NGO support for this bill. 400 people rallied in the rotunda at noon on the day of the committee hearing. Despite far more supporters, each side was given the same amount of time. In other words, supporters could barely introduce themselves while opponents supposedly have 5 minutes each. But when it came to the NorthWestern Energy lobbyist named Alki, he was allowed 12 minutes. The committee delayed its vote until the next day when all of those 400 people had left, and all but one Republican voted against it, resulting in a tie, and the bill died in committee. SB 201, requiring power companies to aggregate net metering. This is most often an issue for farmers with separate meters on barns and irrigation pumps in different locations. It was sponsored by a Republican. It was tabled the same day that SB 504 was tabled, and there was a blast motion the next day to try and bring it out, but that failed on a tie vote. Tabled in committee. HB 219. Whether this bill is good or bad for renewables remains to be seen, but there's some red flag. This is a bill that requires NorthWestern Energy to do a cost-benefit analysis of net metering. First problem with that, obviously, it's the fox in the hen house. NorthWestern Energy supplies the cost data subject to certain criteria set by the PSC. The PSC has specifically limited that criteria to direct costs. In other words, solar job creation can't be counted, climate impacts are not included. NorthWestern Energy, however, is allowed to add other cost categories that they think are important. The bill does one positive thing, and that is it does protect the existing rates for existing net metering customers. This bill was passed and signed, and we just have to wait and see what the details look like as the study comes out, but I suspect there's going to be issues there. Oh, and it looks like there I'm doing my PowerPoint thing again. Okay. Now the bills that are banned for renewables. SB 7. This bill prohibited any kind of subsidies to solar customers. It included no similar prohibition for customers not using solar, clearly discriminating against solar customers. And subsidies may be a particularly broad term. For instance, you can consider a rural customer who lives at the end of a 1 mile road and has long power lines as receiving a subsidy. If he's not using renewable energy, not using solar, no problem. But if he's using solar, he would be prohibited by this bill from having the subsidy of those longer lines, if that's in fact deemed a subsidy, and he'd be required to pay for it. Prohibited subsidies could include that, the cost to run the power to a customer, all sorts of things like that. This bill was passed, but fortunately vetoed by the governor. SB 78. This bill was introduced by Senator Keith Rieger, who happens to be the senator who received more contributions from NorthWestern Energy in its PAC than any other. This bill slashed net metering rates even for existing systems. It double charged solar customers for infrastructure. This bill fortunately died in committee. SB 154. This bill eliminated tax incentives, state tax incentives for solar projects. This bill passed, but it was again fortunately vetoed by the governor. SB 277. This bill prohibited the use of Montana alternative energy loan programs for community solar projects. This bill died in committee, fortunately. And I'm going to jump around a little bit because, as I told you, we keep learning things, and I've organized things just slightly different here, so you may see some back and forth in a minute. But what about the Public Service Commission? What do they stand for? Most commissioners have held previous elected offices and received NorthWestern Energy donations for their previous campaigns. PSC Commissioner Bob Lake received over several years $680 in contributions. Not mentioned in the report, but significant to know, is NorthWestern Energy's president and CEO is a former Montana Public Service Commissioner. There's a little good old boy thing there at the very least. To get kind of an idea where these guys come from, I think you have to look at what I call the open mic incident. An announcement of a ruling setting up very, very low rates and very short contract terms in terms of financing solar facilities, and this would be commercial type facilities, making it almost impossible to build these kind of and obtain financing on these kind of facilities. Telling conversation was caught on an open mic. PSC rate analyst to Bob Lake. Just dropping the rate that much probably took care of the whole thing. Lake, the 10-year contract term and the 10 years is what he said, but the contract term might do it if the price doesn't. And at this low price, I can't imagine anyone getting into it. And that's telling you what they were trained to accomplish with that decision. It doesn't sound like a PSC decision to protect the ratepayers. And we'll look at that just a little bit more as we go on. The PSC also said, as a part of that same decision, that solar pricing could not include a carbon avoidance value adder. In other words, there's this concept of saying, well, I ought to be able to charge a little bit more for energy that's produced without any carbon because that's a value. And the PSC said solar can't do that. But the interesting thing about that, when you look at it, is NorthWestern Energy requested and received exactly the same kind of carbon avoidance value adder when they bought the dams. So what the PSC said was good for NorthWestern Energy wasn't good for an outside solar provider. So who are they really protecting? Interesting thing about that open mic and that decision is that NorthWestern Energy, too, found themselves burdened by that same short contract term if they were trying to go out and build something and get financing. They'd advocated that this be applied to solar, but they'd advocated against it being applied to them and suddenly found themselves facing the same thing that solar was facing. Since our report was written, however, the PSC stepped in and fixed that for NorthWestern Energy's concerns. They faced with evidence that their earlier ruling was having a negative impact on NorthWestern Energy stock prices. The PSC lengthened the contract term from 10 to 15 years while still keeping in that same low pricing. Apparently what the PSC saw as a negative impact on solar projects as a good thing, but saw a negative impact on NorthWestern Energy stock as a bad thing. The fact that these guys in the PSC, and they're highly paid professionals, they have a technical job to do, they have a staff. The truth is, they're political ideologues who deny the overwhelming science of climate change. It sure kind of looks like the campaign contributions, expensive dinners, and the price of NorthWestern Energy stock are the things that are taking priority. What's going on? NorthWestern Energy is trying to hold on to monopoly power. Other states are moving to cleaner, more localized, and more resilient renewable energy-based systems. You heard more about that from Jackie a few minutes ago. NorthWestern Energy is using its gatekeeper control over the grid to prevent it. The ideologues in the legislature and the PSC are putting monopoly power over people. What can we do about it? Well, one thought is the next step is to go around the legislature and the PSC with a ballot initiative. We're just talking about these kinds of things at this point. These are things that we need to look at, but one approach is a ballot initiative to pass HB 504, take essentially that same piece of legislation and make it a ballot initiative. Another, require it consistent with Senator Markey's 100 by 50 bill in the Congress, National Congress, require a renewable portfolio other than hydro be 50% or more by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Another approach, revamp the regulatory structure. Separate producers from transmission providers, establish governmental market managers of some sort, if that can work, and regulate power purchase with incentives to distribution companies to improve efficiency. Interestingly, one of the things the PSC is doing coming up, I just heard they're going to be holding a listening session in Harvard to talk about the fact that NorthWestern Energy took so long to get power back up after their recent wind events. Distributed solar probably would have made it a lot easier to get power up a lot faster. Condemn all NorthWestern Energy Montana assets and create a public utility. Big lift, I know. And I'm saying this in Missoula where we all just saw the city condemn the water company. I'll be honest with you. I think 20 years from now, people are going to recognize that as a very wise decision. We'll see. Require decoupling of profits from the amount of energy generated is another approach. Different types of decoupling systems have been used in other states. NorthWestern Energy doesn't get paid on how much energy they sell. And that's the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening.